Professor Julie Ingram, who was originally a soil scientist turned a social scientist. She is an expert in innovation and is particularly interested in the implication of digital tools in agriculture. And just as a note, Julie is at the inception of the recent Center for Effective Innovation in Agriculture in the UK that you will hear more and more about. And also this conference, because she was the one who introduced us to the CRP program of the OECD. So thank you, Julie. It was a long time in the making.
Thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I'm very honoured. And like Ander, I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing to come to be the last person to speak at the end of the day, because I'm benefiting from everything that's been said before. But also, I hesitated that I might be repeating a few things as well, so bear with me. This title, I'm going to explore this statement, and I think I probably would put a but on the end of it as well, or add a few conditions, which you'll gather as I go along. So what I'm hoping to do is to draw on some insights from research we've done and how we actually operationalise co-innovation, and drawing on some of the literature as well, and a brief example. So the need for co-innovation, there's a lot of words there: co-innovation, digital agriculture, OFE, to unpack and understand. But as we know, digital innovation is broadly defined as application of big data and precision technologies as well. But we often think of it as a technological process, whereas in fact it's a socio-technological process, because it's largely embedded in economic, political, social, ethical relations. So that's where the people come in. We've heard about people in a lot of presentations this morning, and they're central to the process. And when we talk about innovations in this sense as well, I'm not defining them here, I'm just referring to them as new ways of doing things. So whether it's new organisational ways, new technologies, new ways of practice. And against this background, we all know as well that there's a need for a lot more constructive stakeholder dialogue in achieving any sort of transformation that we're trying to do in agriculture. So that sets the scene for this talk. We also know that these digital technologies and tools present huge opportunities: analytical, learning, decision support for farmers. We hear about these all the time. But we also hear this potential is not particularly realised. And the reasons for this are multiple, but the need to design tools and technologies with users has been highlighted. We've come to understand through a large set of literature that we need to work with potential users to design, to analyse, to understand the context, to target the environment, consider scale and long-term purpose as well. Not only does this improve utilisation, of course, which is a main aim, but sustainability as well. We want the longevity in these tools and activities, and we want the social learning and capacity building that goes with them. We don't want just adoption of a tool, we want the larger context as well. And of course, as Laurence was saying earlier, we need to be responsible, and inclusivity and reflexivity are core elements of doing responsible innovation. Co-innovation, it's often used interchangeably with lots of other terms and lots of other methodological approaches or conceptual ideas, just a few of them here that you would have heard mentioned today or previously. But I'm using it in the sense that it's about jointly identifying problems and co-creating solutions together. So from my experience and the work I've done, it's working in groups, and often from a project perspective as well, I have to say. And it helps us as a methodology and as a concept, both to understand what's going on, but also to steer the process itself. So in OFE, it's useful for steering and enabling that process, but also for unpacking and understanding what's going on there. It's a process that advocates an interactive style of problem solving. It's working with local actors' capacity to find solutions to problems. And as I'll go on, I'll explain, it's very much an iterative process that is ongoing. So it's quite a slippery concept to pin down. Methodologically, it can be delivered using different participatory approaches, operating at different scales, different levels of intensity, with different people, and at any stage in the innovation process. And I think those elements of it are quite key because of that, it's quite a messy process and it's not prescriptive necessarily. It can be used to understand how to develop tools, technologies, the gizmos that somebody referred to earlier, but it can also be used as a way of using those tools, enabling processes to happen using tools and technologies, for example, through on-farm experimentation. So if we look at those different participatory approaches, there's action research experimentation, there's participatory workshops, there's citizen science, gamification, human-computer interaction, all sorts of modes of engaging people at different levels of intensity and different types of people as well. When we look at operating at different scales, co-innovation can happen at the institutional, the program level, where reflexivity about a long program or activity can help innovation within that institution. Most of us are used to working with co-innovation within a project setting, so that's our space that we operate in, and that has its own limitations because of funding and short-term time horizons. Co-innovation can operate in initiatives and groups as well, and also, and I added this today, having listened to the talks earlier, at an individual level, because when the farmers and the practitioners were here at the panel earlier, they were very much talking from an individual standpoint. And of course, those link together, they're not individual levels. And it can happen at any stage of the innovation process, this co-element or this collaborative or sharing element of the innovation process, from conception through planning, implementation, analysis, all the way through to dissemination. If we think about tools, ICT tools, for example, advisory tools and technologies, many of them are at the right-hand end of that diagram, in the sense that feedback, testing, human-centered interaction tends to happen with the analysis, the dissemination, the platforms, the spaces for connection and analytical tools and synthesis happen there. Co-design is not quite so common. That's at the conception end, and there's some examples here. There are some examples of user-centered design, where the users are there at the very beginning and the very early conception of tool development, for example. As we move along, there's two-way communication, often involves farmers in content creation of advisory tools and gadgets and other technologies. And then at the far end, towards dissemination, we have a number of apps, decision support tools, for example, where there has been user involvement with prototypes and feedback and testing. And I've outlined the analysis and the dissemination blocks there with red, just to show where I think individual or OFE elements of collaboration might kick in as an individual farmer. So whatever the level of activity, there's a cycle of progression from problem definition, joint framing to jointly framing solutions and inspiring, having your inspirations about solutions there, to testing and observation, which is where the experimentation will take place, to reviewing the results and ultimately applying those results as that cycle progresses. And this is in the plan, act, observe, reflect cycle that we've seen earlier in earlier presentations. And key to all of this is the facilitation of dialogue when you're working with a group. This has been particularly prominent in the research that I've undertaken in co-innovation projects. And another key thing that's happened is because it's iterative and it's adaptive and learning as you go around in the cycle, this adaptive management takes place. So it's learning to manage, but managing to learn as you continue through the process. So it doesn't conclude with a tool or a gadget at the end or a set of data. It continues, and that's why continuous support is so important. And then looking at the researcher input in this process, if we're thinking about on-farm experimentation, we have the cycle in the middle, but then we have the perspectives of the researcher, the external perspectives that they can bring to the joint problem definition and the solution framing. For example, have ideas been tried before? What's in the literature? They can bring design and metrics to the process of experimentation. They can bring data management and analytics when we have results, and support with the interpretation as well. So I just wanted to give you a quick example of some work that came out of a project that was probably 5 or 6 years ago now, called Valerie, an EU Horizon 2020 project, where we had six case studies across Europe. These were series where participatory meetings between scientists and farmers took place with 2 key aims: to support farmer-led experimentation, that's the creation of knowledge, but also we were co-creating together a search engine which was based on the stakeholder vocabulary and concepts. And I wanted to introduce this idea just to show that you can digitize different things. It's not just data, you can also digitize concepts and ideas. So this was quite an ambitious project that tried to do this. I wanted to illustrate 2 points with this example, really. Firstly, that co-innovation is incredibly messy once you involve groups of people. And secondly, that you can digitize not just data, but different sorts of concepts as well. This is one of the case studies of the 6. Actually, it was one in France here with a group of farmers who've been very active since 2005, who worked with an agronomist. We're very innovative, testing out ideas all the time, addressing particular yields in terms of stagnating yields and short rotations and simplified tillage to address some of their soil problems. We started off by asking what their research questions were, and slowly refined these down to try and identify experimental topics that they could conduct on their field with our support. And this is where it became quite an important learning process for the researchers, in that it took a very long time to identify the questions, to articulate them as good research questions, and to refine those questions down amongst the various groups and the farmers to 1 or 2 testable ideas within a trial that was manageable within a short-term project. So what we had down on our work package description didn't exactly match reality at this point. So number 1 moves from questions to refined questions and eventually to number 2, which are the trial topics that were tested. The trial topics were then implemented across 10 farms. The analysis was done with the help of the scientist involved, and then the innovation solution was not necessarily applied, because the innovation solution that the farmers in this case chose to elaborate and expand upon was developing a decision support tool amongst themselves. And I don't mean a platform in any sense or an app. It was a visual descriptive assessment. They made a participatory video together that they could share with other farmers. So that was their way of learning, and that was the artifact, if you like, that came out of that experiment. If we go now to the other element of that case study, it was about understanding how these practitioners, they ask questions and articulate ideas. And we built a search engine around what we called a user-centered ontology. We harvested various concepts and terms, different terms that farmers use, and synonyms and relations between them to construct a vocabulary that provided the architecture for the search engine. And then we populated the research engine not only with their own data, but the repository was populated with data from the other 6 case studies and from the literature. So the user-centered ontology was very much a co-created, a co-design process. We created common vocabulary from the different stakeholders involved. And the idea was to optimize this shared meaning between the practitioners and users, so that when they came to use this search engine, it was meaningful to them. So within this cyclical process I described earlier, we also captured or harvested the stakeholders' common interests and terms, and digitized these, and these were used to construct the search engine architecture, as I've just explained. So I think that example not only illustrated that it takes an awful lot of investment and time, not only from the researchers, but the stakeholders and farmers themselves, and long-term commitment to bring to fruition a tool like that, a search engine, and to avoid stakeholder fatigue along the way, you have to be able to demonstrate a usable prototype, but you don't want to introduce that at a point where it's not ready to be tested. So it's quite a fine balance, particularly in a short project where the pressure was on to move on to the next stage. And then just thinking about co-innovation and OFE perspectives here, and thinking about the co-element of co-innovation, the where, the when, the how, and the what. At what point do people share, and at what point do people collaborate together? Are you doing it at a program level or a group level, as in the example I've just given, or at an individual level, as the practitioners were talking about this morning, who are very much solo experimenters? At what point do they start sharing? If they start sharing their data, do they trust the people they're sharing their data with? So that's going back to my earlier diagram where co-innovation is innovating together with other people, but at any point in the innovation process, from co-design all the way through to dissemination. I also wanted to emphasize that you can digitize any form of knowledge, for example, concepts and ideas, as well as hard data. And you can share different forms of knowledge as well, these ideas, these concepts, these data at any point along that innovation process. Something else that needs emphasizing is these, when you're working together with these groups, either with individual farmers or with groups with scientists, it's a new positioning of relations. They change, so there are new ways of interacting. Facilitation becomes very important. New entrants or new players come into the game. It might not just be farmers and scientists anymore, it might be technology entrepreneurs, muddling the field slightly. The process requires ongoing support, obviously facilitation, somebody to make the connection with the data and to bring the data together if you're putting it on a platform. And that ongoing support is obviously very hard to ensure when you're working within a project space. So within a project space, it becomes more pressurized and more difficult to persuade farmers or those who might be involved to commit to the long term. You've got to manage a means of sharing that data. You've got to think about the data governance, the trust behind it. You've got to be flexible and allow adaptation because, as we've seen, co-innovation can be, it's not a prescriptive process. It's very adaptable. And it's about shared learning and capacity building. And it makes me question when we were thinking about the practitioners earlier about the where the shared learning and the capacity building is when you're a lone farmer experimenter. At what point does that shared learning and capacity building kick in? So that's the point I'm going to finish.
Thank you, Julie.